we're going to continue with our Story of the Bible, session number 6. And just by way of a refresher and catching up with where we were last week, if you recall, we finished with looking at the promises that were made to David, and wondering if you can recall some of the things that were included in those. They did include things like that he was going to have the kingdom forever, that God was going to be his father, and probably one that was key that we talked about last week was the fact that that David was physically going to be present. He was going to see it. And for all of those reasons, they became very interesting to David as a king at the time. And he was very humbled by it all, because he was saying, is this the normal way, God, that you speak to people? The fact that you're giving me these sorts of promises. And where we're at in the timeline, if you like, is that we've following on from David, his son, I'm sort of now in this section here talking about the divided kingdom and the captivity and the period between the Old and New Testament. So that's for tonight. And as I say, we finished with the promises to David and to Solomon. And so we're sort of at that period about 1000 BC, or 1,000 years before Jesus came along on the scene. And the period that we're going to cover tonight really covers about that 1,000 years. So essentially from the time of David through to the time that Jesus appeared. And the kingdom didn't divide initially or immediately. The subsequent king from David was Solomon, his son. And the question could be asked then, in light of where we finished last week, could Solomon have fulfilled those promises that were made to his father David? That is, could he have been the king that was going to basically rule over the kingdom forever? And there were elements of the promises that he did fulfill. So, for example, God said to David that your son is going to build a house for me. And Solomon did. Solomon built a temple for God, and that is, it was a very famous and well-renowned building. But there were other elements that he didn't fulfill. For example, the fact that it says that God was going to be the father of the promised seed to David, and that David physically would see this kingdom that was going to be established. And clearly, David didn't live to see the reign of his son in its entirety. So the answer, of course, is that Solomon didn't fulfill all of those promises. Could he have fulfilled them? Well, that's another question, of course. The reality is that he was given a lot of advantages and a lot of opportunities to be able to be the fulfillment. And he started out well. He prayed for wisdom from God to rule his people, and God gave that wisdom to him. He was very famous for his wisdom. But unfortunately, like so many, with all the opportunities that they are provided, they don't necessarily continue in a good vein. And Solomon did end up being, I'd say, puffed up with the wealth and the fame that he accrued, and began to forget God. in some of the things that he did. And so, as was also prophesied, the kingdom was split. So we're sort of now looking at this period that's on the screen in front of you. So the years, as I say, from 1000 BC through to essentially, we'll call it zero, the year, or the time where time is measured after Jesus came onto the scene. And you can see on the screen there that there's two columns or two rows where we have the kings of Israel on the top and the kings of Judah on the bottom. And that is essentially how the kingdom split. So, and we'll look at this in a map in a moment, but essentially the kings of Israel ruled in the north, and they so just to fill that story in a little, following Solomon, and essentially, he ruled for a long period, for 40 years or more. But he, following his death, it was potentially his son Rehoboam who was going to be the king, and Rehoboam made a very bad decision, and he said that he was going to rule very cruelly and increase taxes and make things very difficult for the people. And as a result of that, the nation split. 10 tribes joined Jeroboam to the north and became the area which was known as Israel at the time, and the 2 tribes remained in the south, which became the kings of Judah. So, and that included the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. So essentially you now see two lines following that, of kings in the north and kings in the south. And they, generally speaking, didn't get along well together, as I guess often happens in close families, that sometimes the relatives don't get on so well. And in the case of Israel and Judah, they struggled with each other at several points during the period that we're looking at on the screen. And so, as I mentioned, and just while that is on the screen, there were prophets that were sent by God throughout all of this period, to both the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, in order to try and warn them about some of the bad things that were going on and the bad outcomes that would result if they didn't change their ways. And we'll look at some of that tonight. But you can see that there's a range of prophets, many of which have books in the Bible named after them, and they were variously sent to the north and the south. And you can see the names of the kings there, also listed for the various periods that followed. So, as I mentioned, the kingdom of Judah was in the south, and the kingdom of Israel in the north. And you can see the tribes there listed that were associated. And so many of the prophets were sent, as I say, some to the north and some to the south. And there was, the key message, I guess, in all of it was, unless you repent, unless you change your ways and to become more like the sort of people that God would like you to be, then the kingdom is going to be taken away from you. And we'll talk about that in a moment as to how that played out. And here are some of those prophets, ones that were sent to the north, to the area of Israel: Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. And the prophets of Judah: Micah, Isaiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Habakkuk. there's a few more, but that gives you a sense in which there were prophets going both to the north and to the south, and the periods there that they prophesied. And you can see the picture there, and we're going to talk a little bit about Elijah. He's supposedly a picture of Elijah, the first of the prophets that went to Israel. And I'll probably just at this point mention that that by and large, the kings weren't that good in terms of following what God wanted. And in fact, it would be fair to say that all of the kings of Israel were bad, and the whole nation was very much given over to idolatry, and as a consequence, they suffered sooner than the kingdom of Judah, which was prolonged a little longer. But we'll talk about that also in a moment. So Elijah, captured in the first book of Kings, and it's fair to say that Elijah was a very charismatic prophet, very pivotal, if you like, and a similar sort of a character, I suppose, to John the Baptist, who came along just prior to Jesus, and it's very much channeled that same very charismatic personality, quite a wild sort of a character, and very strong. And this picture captures an event in his time. He was the king at the time. King Ahab was a very bad king, and he was sent to warn that king that unless he changed his ways, that there would be a drought and a famine in the land. And he didn't. The king didn't change, and there was. And Elijah was during that period at some point was camping near a brook, and God sent ravens with food to keep him alive, and eventually that brook dried up, and so he ended up seeking refuge with a widow to keep him going at the time. But during that time, he was, as you could imagine, given that he gave a very bad message to the king and was being held responsible for the drought and famine that followed, was very unpopular and in threat of his life. And so at a pivotal moment, Elijah calls together all of the prophets, both of the false god Baal that they worshipped at the time, and they were all sort of on the one side and himself on the other, and saying, okay, well, let's sort this out once and for all. Who is the true God? And you might recall the story that's captured in chapter 17 and 18 of 1 Kings. But there's this very dramatic scene where the prophets of Baal are praying to their god Baal, and he's clearly not listening because nothing's happening to their sacrifice on their altar, and so they start cutting themselves and carrying on, and nothing happens, of course, given that Baal was just an idol. And then Elijah, just to very much prove his point, prepares his altar and puts barrels of water all over the altar, and his sacrifice, I presume it might have been seawater, given that they were in a drought. So they effectively this altar's covered in water, and there's no way that it could spontaneously combust, as it were, but yet God sends fire from heaven and consumes the sacrifice and most of what's on the altar as well. And so it's this very strong answer from God as to who is the true God, and a very pivotal moment where it's very clear who is the true God, and so unfortunately, though, Elijah gets disillusioned by all of this because they don't ultimately listen to him, and he feels like it's all gone to waste, and there hasn't really been a change in the heart and the thinking of the nation. And that's and God points out to him that in spite of how you're feeling, Elijah, there are still a remnant of people that I have preserved for my name, and that's very true. It's a message all the way through the Bible that God is always seeking out and saving people that are going to be His in the long term. And so we come to a transition between Elijah and Elisha, and so Elijah eventually, after being a very significant prophet for Israel, is at a time where he's going to die, and there's this period where he's saying, well, Elisha is his potential follower and potentially able to take over from him, and Elijah says to him, look, if you see me taken up to heaven, then you will be effectively the one to follow me. And Elisha asked for a double portion of the miraculous power that belonged to Elisha. And as it turns out, Elisha did see Elijah taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire, and he did get a double portion of the miraculous power that Elijah had. And you can see here listed the 16 miracles that Elisha performed. So quite a list of them. We're not going to go through them all tonight, but coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, there's 8 miracles that are recorded performed by Elijah. So the one that we're going to focus on tonight of these miracles that Elisha performed is the one listed there, number 10, the cleansing of Naaman. Now, Naaman was a king in of Syria to the north of Israel, and he was very sick. He was apparently a very reasonable king and leader of his people, but he was unfortunately had the disease of leprosy, and so he obviously was very miserable with that, and he had a captive handmaid that was in his court who came from Israel, and she reminded him of the fact that there was a prophet in Israel that was able to perform miracles, and so obviously, as you can imagine, when you're very sick, you sort of reach out for any help that you can get, and so he sends a letter off to the king of Israel and says, "Well, I want you to cure me of leprosy." And the king of Israel is obviously saying, "Well, I think that this guy's trying to pick a fight with me because I can't. He's got the wrong person. He's trying to make out that I can cure him, and if I don't cure him, he's going to have a fight with me." And fortunately, there are those in the court of the king of Israel that's able to remind them about Elisha. And so Elisha gets involved in the situation, and Naaman comes to Israel to be cured of his leprosy, and he's expecting something, pretty incredible as a result of this. And so he, in the situation as presented, Elisha doesn't even come out to meet him. He just sends out his servant and he says, I want you to just go off and wash yourself in the River Jordan, which would be fairly muddy sort of a river. And Naaman is completely insulted by all of that. I mean, he says he's got much nicer rivers where he comes from, and why would he bother? This guy's just making fun of me. And his servants, wisely tell him that well, if it was a really difficult thing, you would have surely done it. I mean, if it was some sort of super difficult task that was going to cure you of leprosy, wouldn't you have done that? And rightly, he listens to them, and so he ends up, instead of being as insulted as he is in the picture there, he does end up going off and washing in the River Jordan, and he is, as a result of that, he is cured of his leprosy, and as the record says, that his skin was like a newborn baby's skin. So that's quite an incredible miracle that was performed there, and he does acknowledge the true God of Israel as a result of that, even though he was a foreign king. And I guess the key point and the reason for picking on this particular miracle is that it has parallels and important lessons for us, in that it captures the things to do with baptism, and that for a start, leprosy is a really good image for the nature of sin that people have, that is described in the Bible, in that it is a condition which effectively causes the sufferer to eventually lose all of their feeling, and so they end up damaging themselves, because they've effectively lost their senses, and so they keep on hurting themselves worse and worse, and end up with effectively getting to the point where the skin is too damaged, and even limbs start falling off and things like that. And that's it's an image, quite graphic, but it is describing that progressive losing of sensation and progressive deterioration that is similar to the nature of sin. But also, this image of Naaman getting washed in the river is very much the same image as we would perhaps be expecting to see with baptism. And it's the same thing, the same message that's being given, is that in spite of all of the things that you might expect, all of the miraculous powers that might go with being associated with God, the act of baptism is actually a very humble act. You might think, oh, I'd rather get washed in something cleaner than the River Jordan, but in this case, Naaman was prepared to humble himself and say, I'm prepared to do it because that's what's been asked. And baptism is a lot like that too, being willing to submit and do it God's way. And so, as captured there, even though it was something that he was, perhaps initially insulted about, he was prepared to do it, and so he was restored, and he was effectively, all of that disease was washed clean from him, as can also sin be washed clean from those who are prepared to submit to baptism. So that's a really important lesson, I guess, which is captured by that story, but also illustrates how that a lot of the messages in the Bible and the Bible story are pointing to things which God sees as particularly important lessons for us. Okay, so that's Elisha and Naaman, and another message that was given by the prophets was also, and this one's captured on the screen here, in regard to the coming invasion. So, just to fill in a little bit here, as mentioned, Israel were basically had no good kings, and as a result, they were sent into captivity quite considerably before the kings of Judah. But yeah, so they were captured, went into captivity under the Assyrians, and so there was no longer a kingdom of Israel following the captivity going into under Assyria. And this prophecy from Ezekiel that's on the screen there, from Ezekiel 21, says, remove the turban, take off the crown, nothing shall remain the same, exalt the humble and humble the exalted, overthrow, I will make it overthrown until it be no longer, until he comes whose right it is, and I'll give it to him. And that sort of, I guess, 3 times repetition of the word overthrown has to do with the connection of the fact that there were 3 invasions of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, which essentially was the finish of the nation of Israel and Judah. And this message that was provided by Ezekiel was provided to Zedekiah, who was the last king of Judah. So that's the sort of messages that was being given by the prophets in order to try and warn and to get them to change their way. But the nation of Israel have always been particularly stubborn, and obviously that would have been of enormous frustration to God, given that they were, as he would put it, his firstborn, his the nation he first chose. But the prophets. I guess you could ask the question: well, why did God send prophets? Why did God give prophets to Israel? And one of the reasons for that is the fact that God does give warnings. He wants people to hear. He doesn't just do things without telling people that he's going to do it. And if people have ears to hear, if they're able to listen to his message, then the warning is there. And so the prophet Amos says, surely the Lord God does not do anything unless he reveals his secrets to his servant the prophets. So he, through those prophets, gives warnings to people. And also, so it was obviously to warn the nations of Israel and Judah, but those warnings are also given to the rest of the nations of the world in some of the prophets and the prophecies that have relevance to our current age. And and that's you might actually be surprised at the amount and the detail of information that's included in the prophecies. So we are proposing potentially to follow on this series with a series looking at Bible prophecy and looking at some of the relevance of Bible prophecy to our current age. And you'll be surprised, but we can actually piece together a fairly detailed understanding of the things that are happened or have happened in recent times, and also are about to happen in in the unfolding plan of God. So, yeah, looking forward to potentially having your company for some future seminars looking at Bible prophecy in specific. And just a few examples and a bit of a sneak preview on that. So, for example, and when we read in the Bible about the term latter days, it is generally talking about our present time. So, for example, Isaiah chapter 2 talks about it shall come to pass in the latter days. And, for instance, in Psalm 2, it talks about the kings of the earth setting themselves and the rulers plot together against the Lord and against his anointed. You know, so when we're talking about the kings of the earth, this is talking about, you know, the earth in its broader sense, the whole earth and its rulership. Daniel chapter 7 has relevance, talking about the four great beasts that come out of the earth and how that fits into Bible prophecy and the nations that were going to come following the prophet Daniel, and more relevant to the time of the end, as it says there on the screen. Daniel chapter 11 talks about that time and the king of the south and the king of the north that are captured in that prophecy. And finally, you know, and yet to, of course, to be fulfilled is the prophecy captured in Zechariah 14, when Yahweh, or when the Lord, shall be king over all the earth. So clearly that prophecy is yet to be fulfilled. So things to look forward to in looking at Bible prophecy. So you know, I guess following on from this, as I say, the nation of Israel and the capital at that time of Samaria was taken captive by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and so that effectively the 10 tribes were no more at that point, and you can see sort of some pictures and carvings which capture and depict that time. And then at that, so once that had occurred, then there was the remaining 2 tribes in the land of Israel, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And then over a series of invasions, eventually Judah was also taken captive into Babylon, and Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. So that's, yeah, I guess you could say the end of the kingdom of Israel in the past, because essentially that was the last king of Israel, and to this day there has not been another king of Israel. So it's something which we yet look forward to that kingdom being re-established. Okay, so if we're looking at the Bible, of course, this series is, you know, I guess entitled "The Story of the Bible." It would be fair to say that a lot of the Bible focuses on the period once the effectively that kingdom had finished and the nation had gone into captivity. And so there was a number of the prophets who focused on this period. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem at the time, 626 to 585 BC, and prophesied from there. Ezekiel and Daniel went into captivity in Babylon and prophesied from there. And then there were a few that returned to Jerusalem and also prophesied: Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, and Haggai. So, you know, a number of this period is spanned by quite a number of the prophets in the Bible, and the book of Esther also appears in this in the narrative at around this period. And then later on, once back established in Jerusalem, Malachi prophesied, and he was the last of the Old Testament prophets. So if you look at it on your bookshelf, as it were, you've got the books that we have looked at so far. We've looked at the books of the law in the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So those were the 5 books mainly penned by Moses. And then we've got a lot of history books, which are listed up there on the top shelf of the diagram. And then we've got poetry books, the major prophets and the minor prophets. And all the ones that appear in green there have relevance to this period of captivity. So the time that we're looking at the moment. And it would be fair to say it was this really pivotal time in Jewish history where they essentially realised that they were on the wrong track, and the prophets had warned them that this was going to occur, and it came to pass. Much as the kings at the time didn't believe them, it did actually happen, and it was, I think, probably the way that it was described to me was that, if you like, the difference between the record in the Book of Kings versus the Book of Chronicles is that the Book of Kings looks at the events as they occurred, and the Book of Chronicles looks at it from the point of view of those that were captive in Babylon, and probably a more hopeful tone about the potential returning into the land of Israel. And and some of the dates involved in here are really important because, for instance, the prophet Daniel spoke very much about this, and those that could understand what the prophets were saying realised and knew that they were going to be in captivity for a period of about 70 years. So they actually had been told how long the captivity would occur, and it did turn out the way that had been prophesied. And also, the prophet Daniel spoke about a period beyond the captivity, and in fact beyond the return into the land, right through to the coming of Jesus. And that, as I say, Jeremiah had prophesied that they would return to the land after 70 years. And Cyrus had, once he had conquered Babylon, so this was the Median and Persian empires, he did allow the Jews to return. And over a subsequent period of the kings, there were a series of returns into the land, and they started to rebuild the city and the walls and the temple at Jerusalem. So Isaiah had also prophesied that, in fact, he even prophesied 200 years before that what was going to come to pass and eventually occurred under the period of Ezra. So they were led back into the land by 2 priests, Zerubbabel and Joshua, and the work was continued by Ezra and Nehemiah. But as mentioned, they did not restore the monarchy, so they didn't have a king any longer, and haven't had it ever since. And this is consistent, of course, with the prophecy reminding you of the comment we made earlier on about from Ezekiel that highlighted there, until he comes, whose right it is, and that we believe refers to Jesus, who is the rightful next king of Israel, and in fact king of the world. following that decree and the returning into the land, Daniel's prophecies associated with the and he talks about this in his chapter 9. He has a prophecy which refers to 70 weeks, and it when you take those 70 weeks and using the Bible principle of a day for a year, apply that, it spans the period from the time of the captivity through to the return of Jesus. And so the people, as mentioned, did return to the land. They did rebuild the temple and then the walls surrounding Jerusalem, in spite of all of the opposition of the nations around them, who not only felt threatened by that, but also very scornful of their attempts. And so that if you like, the nation, as it were, albeit small, was re-established. And it would be fair to say that there was a spiritual revival during this time, where they were effectively in the land and trying to worship, but it would be fair to say that they also were, some of the older people that were around at the time were remembering back to the former glory of the nation, and in fact were disappointed that the temple that they had built was nothing like the temple that had been built at the time of Solomon. And in fact, it would be fair to say that that God's glory, while it did enter the temple built by Solomon, it never entered this temple. So the period that we're going to now just cover briefly follows that return from exile to the land. And if you see it on the timeline here, you've got that period described where they've been in captivity in Babylon from 606 BC through to Judah returning 70 years later. Judah's captivity begins in 606 BC. So Jerusalem is destroyed in 586 BC, and Judah returns 70 years following that in 536 BC. So that's the period of the captivity, and then there's a 400 to 500 year period following that through to the time when Jesus is born. This period would be, I guess, described as a period of darkness or of silence, in that Malachi, as mentioned, was the last prophet who prophesied in Jerusalem, and then there are no more books of the Bible until the time of the New Testament. And during that period, the Persian kingdom is overtaken by the Greek Empire, and the region of Israel during that time is largely ruled over by the Greeks. I guess the Greek approach was very much of religious tolerance. They were sort of okay for the Jews to practice their religion, but after the death of Alexander the Great, the generals under him, as prophesied by Daniel, split into four, or split the kingdom into four, and Israel found itself in a place of dispute between two parts of the Greek Empire, and they were, for those that are interested, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and they struggled, between the two of them. and effectively Israel got trampled every time there was an invasion from the north or the south. Israel was in the middle of it all, and the cruelest of all of the rulers, a ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, had an image of himself erected in the temple, and proclaimed that he was in fact a manifestation of Zeus, and imposed all sorts of terrible things upon the Jews, and humiliated them and their worship, and basically rubbed their noses in it in every opportunity that he could get. And as a result of that, and this is a little bit of history here, and this, I guess this coin captures that ruler we we're just talking about. But yeah, the Maccabees was a group that rose up in revolt against this humiliation, and reclaimed I guess Jerusalem, and purified the temple, and in fact this was how the feast of Hanukkah is actually established, and originates because of this tradition where the oil of the lights used to be only for one day, now had to burn for 8. So it's just a Jewish tradition that established at that time. But the Jews essentially had control briefly of their land for a small time, until the Roman Empire came along and swallowed up the Greek Empire, and effectively took control of the whole area, which was now known as Palestine. And so Israel has essentially been completely dominated by foreign powers, and they desperately needed a king. Now, they had been in expectation of a king coming along. The prophets had even told them that a king was going to come, and those that were listening to those prophets would have expected, if they'd even looked at the prophecy of Daniel and listened to the key messages, would have been expecting at around the time of Jesus that the Messiah was going to come. And there were some that were. At the time when Jesus was born, there were those that had been expecting these events. So, for example, Simeon in the book of Luke is said that he was waiting for the consolation of Israel that was promised. And a woman by the name of Anna spoke of all of those that were looking for the redemption in Jerusalem. So they were the sorts of people that were looking for a Messiah to come at that time, as had been prophesied. But when Jesus did come onto the scene, he was not quite what they were expecting. And I guess that's setting the scene for our next talks, because they desperately needed a king, but as I say, Jesus was different to what they had been looking for. So next time we're going to, all being well, look at the life and the death of Jesus.